Hey everyone, welcome to the very first episode of Now You Know. I decided I wanted to start a new segment and bring up some interesting facts and just have a good time with it. I'm going to try to do this every week. Of course, I can't guarantee that I get really caught up in a lot of other projects, but I will do my best. Today's topic is going to be fairy tales. Now, it's not the fairy tales you think you know. I'm going to contrast and compare the original fairy tales with the newer fairy tales, and this is how they differ. Fairy tales originated in Germany. Of course, we all know of the Grimm Brothers. Jacob and William Grimm made it their life's calling to go around to all these places, study all of these different cultures, and write down and record a lot of the fairy tales, which were stories to teach morals and obedience to children. A lot of these stories were disappearing with the subcultures as they were being wiped out, so a lot of these stories, especially in Germany, based all of their fairy tales on obedience. If children disobeyed their parents, bad things would happen. The liars and cheaters were to be punished, and the good were to be rewarded, but not always. We didn't want kids thinking that, oh, if I'm good, I'll get a fairy godmother or I'll get a piece of candy. So, now, the French version of the fairy tales, which is what we know today as, the popular Disney fairy tales, stories like Cinderella and Snow White, these German fairy tales by the Grimm Brothers were taken from a man by the name of Charles Perrault, and he sugar-coated them. He thought they were too grisly for his French audience, and then, of course, Disney incorporated those because they were less frightening to children. In the French version of story tales, they were directed more towards teaching a moral, at the end of the day, the good get their just reward, the bad are punished. But it wasn't necessarily about obedience as much as it was be good, don't be bad. Now, let's just take Cinderella. In the version we know, the Disney version, the French Charles Perrault version, Cinderella gets a fairy godmother, and she gets the glass slippers, and she goes to the dance and dances with the prince, and she loses her slipper, and the prince has to go all about the kingdom trying to match this slipper to this one woman. And of course he stops by Cinderella's house, and the ugly stepsisters try on the slipper. It's too tight, it doesn't fit them, and of course the stepmother is hiding Cinderella in a back room. The prince kind of catches on, and he gets the girl, and they live happily ever after. In the German version, it is much different. It's similar, but it's a lot different. In the German version, there was no fairy godmother. There was a magical tree that was sort of embodied by Cinderella's biological mother, who bestowed her gifts. And on one night she got, a dress, and the second night she got a pair of gold slippers. They weren't glass, they were made out of gold. In this version, The stepsisters are not ugly. In fact, they're really pretty. So Cinderella gets all dressed up, goes to the ball, and she's having dinner with everybody. And the stepsisters are saying, wow, who is this girl? She's so beautiful. I wish I knew who she was. And, oh, she could be real competition. We better keep an eye on her. So, of course, she and the prince dance. She runs down the stairs and goes home. And the prince keeps having these dances, hoping that Cinderella will come back. And the one night, he decides, I have to stop her before she runs away. So he coats the stairs of the palace with pitch, which is tar. And that's how Cinderella loses her slipper. So the prince grabs up the slipper and again has to go searching about the kingdom for the right woman. He finally gets to Cinderella's house, and the stepsisters are absolutely determined to make this slipper fit. So the stepmother tells the eldest sister, since you're eldest, you should have a chance. Get the slipper on and go marry the prince. But the same problem arises that her foot is too big. So what she does is actually cut off part of her foot to make the slipper fit. And of course, these are gold, they're not see-through, so there's not really a huge trace of blood everywhere. So she makes the slipper fit, the prince carries her off on the back of the horse, and then this wise crow comes and says, it's not the right girl, you need to go back. She's a liar. The prince discovers that she's cut off part of her foot. He's kind of disgusted, as the rest of us probably are. Goes back to the house, and then the younger stepsister tries the slipper. The same problem comes. Her foot's too big. She cuts off part of her foot, but the slipper fits. The prince takes her. The wise crow comes and calls her out on it. So finally, the prince goes back to the house, finds Cinderella. She puts on the slipper, and it fits. And he's made sure she's not cut off part of her foot. But the thing is this slipper is now, it's not directly mentioned in the story, but you have to think, it's caked in blood. It's just dripping with all of his blood, and he's like, here, try it on. And she's like, okay. It's just absolutely disgusting. So he takes her on the back of his horse, rides out the kingdom, and the wise crow finally says, you got the right girl. So they go and they have a big wedding. And of course, they invite the stepsisters and the stepmom. It's the only family she really has left. And while the stepsisters are walking up the aisle, the wise crow, maybe a good bit of his buddies, I suppose, come and they peck out the stepsisters' eyes so that they'll be deformed for the rest of their lives. Nobody will want them. And that is their just punishment for lying and cheating and disobeying the prince, the law of the land. So the prince and Cinderella get married, and of course there's still a happily ever after, but because Cinderella was a good moral person, listened to her stepmother even though she was a complete bitch, she still did her work with a smile. She didn't begrudge her family too much that her father had passed away and given her all of his property, but then the stepmother kind of took it over last minute, and there you have it. Now, there are no singing mice, no magical fairy godmother coming and bippity-boppity booing everywhere. The French version is obviously very different. It's what we know, but it is not what the Grimm Brothers had intended. One German fairy tale that stuck out in my mind so strongly, and it was only like a page and a half, it was a very, very short story, was this fairy tale about this disobedient child. The child would not listen to his mother, and eventually God killed him for it. So he got sick, he died, and as they are burying him in his grave, he keeps shooting his arm out of his grave. So his mother comes and with a switch hits his arm down, and his arm goes back into the grave. Now he does this 2 or 3 more times. The mother swats him, yells at him this last time and says, "You need to learn to be obedient. That's why you're here. You were disobedient and now you need to obey." And the boy's arm goes down in the grave and he learns his lesson, I suppose, but you have to think, what kind of supernatural being would say, "You disobeyed your mom, so I'm going to kill you, and the only way you're going to obey your mother is in death"? I'm pretty sure that Charles Perrault completely skipped that one over. The Disney Corporation obviously never picked that one up. I mean, there wasn't enough content anyway for a full-fledged movie, but it's grisly. That's the difference between the more original fairy tales, the Brothers Grimm version, and then the French sugar-coated version by Charles Perrault. And then Disney took his fairy tales because they were not so grisly. There's no cutting off of body parts or eyes being pecked out. I hope you guys learned something today. This is something I learned in a Brothers Grimm class at college. And of course, you have to take all of these prerequisites and you learn some interesting but rather useless things that don't necessarily pertain to your major. And I feel like that's probably going to be where I'm going to get a lot of my content, is just these interesting areas that I've learned or that I've been looking into because they're controversial issues in the news that we've actually covered in different classes that I've been in. Now you know fairy tales. Thanks for watching. See you next time.